I'm Mark Bruzonsky, and thank you for tuning in to Mideast Realities. We're in Cairo, Egypt, the largest of the Arab countries, the first Arab country to make peace with Israel, and in many ways the most important of the Arab countries, not in terms of oil wealth or petrodollars, but in terms of size, population, economy, and political impact. We're in fact on the rooftop garden of the Carlton Hotel, right in the middle of downtown Cairo. A hotel I first came to in 1971. I was a student at the time, representing the international student movement for the United Nations at the United Nations while going to law school. I was invited by the UN Association of Egypt, which had its offices across the street, and I was taken to this hotel. A very small, very well-kept Egyptian hotel with this lovely rooftop terrace, especially in the summer months. But we're here to discuss the situation in the Arab world with Mohammed Sid Ahmed. Mohammed's one of the best-known political analysts here in the Middle East, throughout the Middle East, not just in Egypt. And he's an old friend of mine. In fact, I met him in 1978, the second time I came to Cairo. At that time, I was a young journalist. I had just published a book for Congressional Quarterly called The U.S., Israel, Oil in the Middle East. And I was invited by the Egyptian government to spend 3 weeks here in Egypt. It was just before the political events that shocked this region. It was in the months before Anwar Sadat's trip to Jerusalem. And in fact, I played a very small footnote role in history at that time. Through a variety of circumstances, I ended up meeting with President Sadat privately, arranging for him to send a telegram to a conference I was about to attend in Israel. At the time, it was unheard of, the idea that an Arab leader from an Arab country would be sending a telegram to anybody in Israel. And it was the days before, in fact, he had decided to go there. It was some days later that he decided. Anyway, I left the next day after meeting with him, was on a plane to Athens to connect to Israel, woke up with an English language paper on my lap and a picture of the President of Egypt and myself on the very top of the paper staring at me. So it was a small footnote in the history of this region. Of course, things have now happened. Political agreements, wars, the destruction of Lebanon, destruction of Iraq, revolutions in Sudan, in Algeria, great tension here in Egypt. But nevertheless, it's good to be back. I've probably been here 100 times since the 70s, and we'll be joined in just a few moments by Mohammed Sid Ahmed, one of the best-known commentators on the political affairs of this region.
The process is still that of conflict in the region. I know that the United States is very keen on the idea that peace is there, already there. I think that when President Clinton came for the first time as president to the Middle East a short time ago, his message was, now the frame of reference should be peace. And it is time for war on those which are perceived as the enemies of peace. In other words, peace and terrorism cannot be compatible. Arafat, for example, should take a very staunch stand towards Hamas because the Hamas people are terrorists. Egypt should take a very staunch stand towards Gaddafi because he's identified with terrorism. And of course, that has become, I think, for the United States, the frame of reference. In the region here, issues are much more complex. One would be questioning whether we are really having a situation of peace. It's not a peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It is a diktat situation. There is no guarantee that it will ever achieve the self-determination of the Palestinians. The opposite is rather the most expected. And at this juncture, one cannot talk of an agreement of peace that enjoys a consensus amongst Palestinians. The opposite is much closer to the truth. What the Israeli government is now doing is to distort in a certain way the 242 resolution. 242 resolution talks of land for peace. Now we're talking of land for a Middle East market, actually. Peace is identified with the Middle East market. In other words, instead of Israel ensuring its security by means of occupied Arab territory, it is ensuring it by planting an economic presence all over the Arab world.
While this is promoted as peace, and while the President of the United States comes here and talks about peace, the reality is that certain classes and certain political regimes are benefiting from this, but the people themselves are disenchanted, frustrated. Your own wife used the phrase when I got here on the first day, "We've been had." Now, she never really explained herself. I guess I just sort of assumed that
They're more or less something of the sort. But what I mean to say is...
What does "we've been had" mean?
Yes, well, they've got us. They've trapped us.
And who's they?
They is the Americans and the Israelis.
Plus?
And, yes, and perhaps also the establishment all over the region.
My name is Mark Bruzonsky. I'm the host of this program, and we're in downtown Washington today. We're on K and 16th, in fact, in the heart of downtown Washington, and we're at the offices of an organization that goes by the name the Council on the National Interest. This program, Mideast Realities, is dedicated to one proposition, and that is that the real realities of the situation are not being forthrightly discussed either by the governments in the region or by the United States government, or by many of the groups that are involved in one way or another in Middle East affairs. And the impression I got from the report was that this report would go over very well in Amman, Jordan with the Hashemite regime, or in Saudi Arabia with the Saudi regime, or frankly, for that matter, in Israel, which is very much desirous of seeing this peace process continue. In fact, you know, they used to want us to call it Judea and Samaria, and some of us insisted on calling it the West Bank, and they want us to call what's happening the peace process, and they've succeeded pretty well. But in many people's minds, it's not a peace process at all. It's a continuation of policies that the United States and Israel have pursued for a very long time.
I have no argument with that at all. The occupation is continuing. We make that statement in there, as a matter of fact. The occupation by Israel is continuing, and as long as the Israelis, particularly the IDF and particularly the border forces, are in charge of the lives of the young Palestinians, there's going to be trouble. And this is a basic problem in the whole peace process.
We're at the annual walkathon of the Palestine Aid Society. Not sure what to call him, Chairman Arafat, Chief Arafat, President Arafat. Not sure what to call the authority that he heads. He calls it the Palestine National Authority. The Israelis and the Americans call it the Palestinian Authority. But anyway, in reality, less than 1/10 of the money that was promised has been delivered. There have been no elections. Promises have been broken right and left. More land has been taken. The process of disenfranchisement and putting the Palestinians on reservations has continued. And now it continues with, in fact, the imprimatur of the former organization that was called the PLO. And I say former because in reality, the PLO doesn't exist anymore. What exists as an authority that's funded by the United States and by Israel. And in fact, the analogy with what happened to the American Indians in the previous century is becoming more and more and more, unfortunately, accurate.
Just to give you a brief idea of why it's so important for us to be here. In the last couple of years, since the Madrid-Oslo Accords, the conditions for Palestinians in the occupied territories have deteriorated drastically. Unemployment in Gaza has reached almost 60%. Palestinian political prisoners remain in jail. The Israelis continue with impunity to confiscate Palestinian land, especially in Jerusalem. Before it used to be, you hear land, they confiscate, they don't say much about it. Now Rabin stands in the middle of the Knesset and says, we are taking this land in Jerusalem and we're going to use it to build settlements.
It will not be state guns anymore. This is over, this game. I don't see ourselves going back to that. but we'll have all sorts of things simultaneously. It's finished, the war of blocks. It won't be one block against another block. This is finished. But what we will have is the reasons that brought about war between blocks will express themselves otherwise. There will be a lot of intercourse. There will be business people working on either side together, but there will also be groups that will stand up to it. There will be terrorism. There will be also very daring forms of terrorism that we will have simultaneously forms of intercourse and extreme forms of conflict side by side.
Are you saying that if in fact this isn't a real peace with the Palestinians, and that it doesn't look like it is, it looks like an imposed settlement in which they are given ghettos and Bantustans and reservations to live on, and the Israelis win? If that's what it is, as each year makes that more clear,
there will be no peace.
Isn't there going to be more of a sense of we've been had, more of a sense of humiliation,
of course,
more of a sense of alienation?
There will be texts that will be attributed to the name of peace. Agreements for whatever the signatures of this agreement, what worth these signatures could have, that will exist. There will be business communities interested in hoping to get doors open in the Western America thanks to the Israelis, and Israelis taking advantage of this. That will be the forces attributed to peace. But there will be also, against that, a wide range of opposition forces becoming more assertive than ever.
Even here in Egypt, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the press, most of the intellectuals still refuse to meet in Egypt with Israeli delegations.
Yes.
You refuse, I believe.
Yes. So far, in Egypt, all Israeli delegations are boycotted, are not met by Egyptians.
We're waiting for Dr. Haider Abdel Shafi, who this evening is going to give a talk about the peace process and about the PLO-Israeli agreement and about what's happening in the Middle East. I suspect most of the viewers of Mideast Realities may not know who Dr. Haider Abdel Shafi is. And yet, just a few years ago, he was on international television and was quite famous. He was, in fact, the spokesperson, the main delegate at the Madrid peace talks and subsequently at the Washington peace talks. He was the man chosen by Yasser Arafat to head the Palestinian delegation and to give the key Palestinian talks about their cause and about the peace process. The reason that he has not been heard from subsequently in the international media and is no longer the head of the peace delegation is because Dr. Shafi decided that he did not approve of the agreements that were made between Yasser Arafat and the Israelis. And in fact, he refused to go to the White House ceremony on September 13th, 1993. And he has refused to go to subsequent ceremonies that have taken place in Cairo and other locations in Gaza and the occupied territories.
I criticize the agreement as having many failures, and that, in my opinion, it was very doubtful that it is going to realize the just and durable peace that everybody was looking forward to.
Welcome to Mideast Realities. I'm your host, Mark Bruzonsky. This week and next, we have rather unusual MER programs. Usually, we invite the most honest and independent experts we can find to discuss the realities of the Middle East situation. We do so because the establishment media, both print and TV, far too often obscure and misrepresent the actual realities of the situation. There are many interest groups and think tanks whose job it is to influence the media away from realities and towards the viewpoints of various governments and what can be termed the post-Cold War military-industrial complex. The Israeli-Jewish lobby's influence in Washington is very well known, of course, and it has never been greater than with the Clinton administration. Consequently, with MER, we try to discuss the actual realities of the Middle East, as opposed to what the lobbyists, the government spokesmen, and the arms merchants want you to think is happening. This evening, however, we're at the Adass Israel Synagogue in Washington, D.C., to hear what Moshe Aarons has to say. Moshe Aarons, one of Israel's leading politicians from the Likud party, has served as Israel's ambassador to the U.S., as well as both Israeli defense and foreign ministers.
We are not far from a second round of elections. Elections in Israel and the United States are usually, not always, held just about at the same time in November in a year that is divisible by 4. Our elections are now scheduled to be held in November of 1996, just as the coming elections in the United States. And at least by looking at the polls today, it looks like the Labour victory in 1992 might have been almost accidental in nature.
That the Americans believe that the time has come to make out of peace the frame of reference, and everything that stands up still to peace as the small writing that will be overcome eventually. It's just details. The situation is not at all that. What we actually have today is that if things continue the way they are, we will not have peace at all. We will eventually have things signed on paper here and there, but the relevance of which, when it comes to the behavior of societies throughout the region, the politics of the region, will have nothing to do with what will have been said.
All right, I have.
You are speaking. You are speaking. You and Mr. Perez, having read your book.
Oh yes.
Well, you're not going to find that tomorrow morning unless something's going on in Oslo that we don't know about on the Golan Heights. But the die is cast, isn't it, on the Palestinians? I mean, your and Mr. Shamir's hopes to find a new Palestinian leadership, some alternative to the PLO. The PLO was on the ropes, but indeed this government revived the PLO, revived Yasser Arafat. There's no turning back from that, is there?
I'm not sure that that's the case, because it's not at all clear that Yasser Arafat could get elected in free and democratic elections amongst the Palestinian population. He's certainly facing a great deal of opposition from many directions, by the way, not only from the Muslim fundamentalists, but also from many Palestinian intellectuals who have assimilated, maybe some superficially, the norms that govern Israeli society, who have seen a democratic system at work, who have seen the free press, who have seen respect for civil liberties, and they don't like what they see when they look at Arafat's leadership. I don't think Arafat is very eager to hold elections. As a matter of fact, I understand that whatever elections in quotation marks are being discussed are not going to be elections for his position. He considers that already assured. He doesn't feel that he needs a mandate from the people. But my own prognosis is that he is not a permanent fixture out there as leader of the Palestinian population. What will come in instead? I don't know. My thesis has always been and continues to be that we must negotiate with people who have a mandate from the Palestinian population. And when somebody says to me, well, whoever will be elected in true elections may be even worse than Arafat, maybe Hamas, maybe Muslim fundamentalists, I say, so be it. If it turns out that the majority of the population does not want peace with Israel, then we're not going to solve anything by signing an agreement with somebody who doesn't represent that majority.
Israel's attempt at keeping at having this monopoly over nuclear weapons alone is actually inciting the whole area into becoming a nuclear area.
Are you saying there's a nuclear arms race underway in the Middle East, even though it's not much talked about?
Yes, I think that if Israel is going to stick to the stand it has, there will be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. I don't think that anybody will accept Israel alone to have nuclear weapons in this area ever.
Faisal Husseini, Hisham Sharabi, and the PLO ambassador to Washington, Hassan Rahman, with a security detail.
You're a baseball fan too? No. And in fact, I have this new awesome shirt where it's cornfield print. This is what I wear. I'll wear it. You gotta watch our Later.
This is Eric Rillo of Le Monde and Hisham Sharabi from here at Georgetown. Yitzhak's the bad guy, and Shimon's the good guy. The reality, of course, is that it's the Israeli Labor Party which has pursued these policies for 40 years. They've been in collusion with the Hashemites to put down the Palestinians.
Started the settlements.
They started the settlements, they created the Gaza ghetto, and now they come forward and Shimon says all these nice things, but the reality is that the Palestinian cause has been pushed under while the occupation has been continued, and while 73% of the occupied territories that the UN has demanded repeatedly be considered occupied territories are under Israeli control. So it leads me to ask you, you write a report which says the US has adopted an ambiguous and inadequate policy on final status for Jerusalem, seeming to avoid the key issues. Well, the moment I read that, I said to myself, CNI has adopted an ambiguous and an inadequate policy on final status concerning the Israeli-Palestinian situation.
We'll never agree.
When there was a military takeover in Algeria and the democratic forces that were about to be swept into power through the democratic ballot box were repressed, 30,000 of them now being held in prisons and tortured, Egypt has terribly repressive policies. All kinds of human rights organizations have condemned the Egyptian government for its torture and repression. Saudi Arabia, we all know it's a police state and a state that gets tremendous amounts of...
I don't agree with you on that at all. I don't think Saudi Arabia is a police state.
Saudi Arabia is not a police state?
No, I don't think so.
With completely arbitrary policies in terms of human rights and in terms of who's put in jail?
Actually, there are very few people in jail in Saudi Arabia.
Just in the last few months, hundreds of intellectuals and clergy have been arrested for doing no more than speaking up in the mosques.
Listen, let's talk about Israel and the Palestinians.
Why is it so difficult for the Council for the National Interest to take positions and policies on major developments taking place in other countries? The impression that's given, I have no idea exactly where your budget comes from and who's funding it and that kind of thing. I do know how the organization was started, and I know that that was done with money from Saudi Arabia. But that's 5 years ago.
No, that's not true. The money that came from Saudi Arabia was contributed by private businessmen, and it was not a significant...
The brother of King Fahad?
It was not a significant part of the amount of money that was generated even in the early years, and now
the entire bill for the organizing meeting in Orlando, Florida, wasn't paid for by the brother of the King of Saudi Arabia.
Yes, there was a. We're not concerned about all of the other problems in the Middle East. We're not going to solve all.
Then it would have been more fair to say Council on U.S.-Israel Relations, rather than you just a few minutes ago were saying we're concerned about the national interests of the United States in the Middle East. You're really concerned with the U.S.-Israel connection, and the name is a bit misleading. Of course, there are a lot of organizations in Washington with misleading names.
Well, that's possibly true. At
the end of the day, it gets very convoluted. Aren't we dealing with a region that is being manipulated by the Americans and derivatively by the Israelis, keeping the Arab parties fighting each other, keeping one group against another?
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to that, I said it a moment ago, I said what we have witnessed is not an elimination of the contradictions in the region, it is a displacement of this contradiction. The most acute contradictions in the region now are between the Arabs themselves, not only Arab peoples and Arab regimes, but even Arab regimes. The peace process has been the elimination of contradictions between Arab regimes and Israel into becoming contradictions with the Arab world itself. The peace has not created what the objective of peace was. It is not a situation where everybody gets something out. It is not an improved situation for everybody. It's an improved situation for Israel. It is perhaps not all Israelis are aware of it. There are critics of the peace process in Israel itself, but grosso modo, Israel now has linkages with most of Arab countries. It's no longer in a Middle East ghetto. It is just the opposite. It is today, it could project the image that it has never been as victorious as it has become. The Arabs are told that they're not defeated, but they feel that they are. Russia in World War III was described as not having been defeated, and it is the best way to keep it defeated. I think that what is happening now is that the Arabs are being told that they have not been defeated, while they really have been defeated. Now, you can't play that game indefinitely. What is now happening in the region is to say that you can't put the name peace onto something that doesn't have that meaning at all. So sooner or later, things will have to be rectified somehow.